Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for the part 3, the inevitable part 3, April Q&A. We've done lots and lots of question asking. Not much talk of VRAM. Can someone ask a question about VRAM? I'd love to discuss VRAM. So hopefully we get to do that in this part 3. Hopefully we can do that. But anyway, we should probably get on with it. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Skytech Gaming, a provider of pre-built gaming PCs in California. They offer lifetime technical support backed by well-trained customer support, and all their systems feature a 1-year parts warranty. One of their newest pre-builts is the Azure 2, which Skytech Gaming sent over for us to check out. This is a well put together PC that looks great, the BIOS has been tuned for optimal cooling and noise performance, and the cable management is extremely neat. It features the new GeForce RTX 4070 along with the Core i5-13600K, and this allows it to deliver impressive mid-range performance, while supporting all the latest and greatest features such as DLSS 3 frame generation, ray tracing, and AV1 encoding. So, to get the right PC built for you, check out the link in the video description. Alright, DOA recently released a video showing major variance between units of the same SKU, in this case, Ryzen 5 7600 CPUs, but it could apply to all kinds of hardware. Are you absolutely sure you don't receive, do the quotation for me, golden samples for reviews that are not representative of what the average retail experience would be? Would you consider anonymously buying a retail unit, then going back and comparing it to the review sample you received to make sure there's no trickery going on? Admittedly, I haven't really seen DOA's video, so I don't know exactly how much variance we're talking about here. And I haven't looked into it specifically with AM5 CPUs, so again, I can't really comment on that. Having said that, I have bought a few AM5 CPUs and I have benchmarked them and not seen any difference between the review samples I got. But again, that's sort of one retail sample versus one review sample. Sounds like DOA did a lot more, so obviously the more, you probably, well, for one, when you get a wider range of samples, we know silicon quality does vary, so you could get a couple of poor silicon quality CPUs and some better quality silicon CPUs, and maybe there's some variance there. Again, though, I would have expected at the stock standard frequencies that they're all meant to meet, that performance would be much the same.
I think it's because it's a locked CPU, so it's like, because it's a 65 watt part, there are some power limits there, and potentially under the same power limits, the clocks are going to vary a little bit.
Yeah.
I've only seen brief parts of the video. I think that was the general gist of it.
Yep, that makes sense.
But yeah, like you said, I don't think the variance would be too massive in terms of performance. But
yeah, and again, I haven't seen the DOA video, but I'd really like to see all of those CPUs tested on a few different motherboards as well. Mm-hmm. Because the motherboard could really heavily influence those voltages and how efficient certain CPUs are running. But interesting nonetheless. But as far as purchasing retail samples and comparing to review samples, we do a lot of that already. And a lot of the hardware we do end up testing is retail samples or retail units anyway. So yeah, I don't think there's really a golden sample thing. I know I think it was it the Core i7 8700K that came up, and I ended up getting 10 of them from PC Case Gear and found they all overclocked to roughly 5 gigahertz, and they were all pretty similar. So yeah, I don't think that's too much of an issue, but that's an interesting angle there with the locked CPUs, because they do have a very specific power budget that they have to work with there. So that could, change how they're able to clock. But again, you could find that the results change depending on the motherboard you use, because the behavior with voltages and memory timings and stuff differs quite a bit between the various motherboard brands. So yeah, that could be a huge rabbit hole to go down, that one, and suck up weeks and weeks and weeks upon testing.
Yeah, and I think with the golden sample discussion always comes up every so often. Mm-hmm. Like, are they being a bit dodgy with the review samples? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people always think of that angle of sort of, there's the incentive there, right, to show the product in the best light. They want to be at the top of the benchmark chart, so you try and send the best silicon. But these days, with the way the media landscape works and YouTubers and stuff, if it was discovered that a company was deliberately sending golden samples, it would be a scandal.
Yeah.
It would blow up, that sort of thing would just cause a lot of discussion. There'd be Reddit posts and all that sort of thing. It would bring a lot of unwanted attention. So while there is that angle of, they could benefit by having the processors at the top of the charts, if it's discovered, which again, it's pretty likely that if all the review samples are at performing a certain level and all the retail samples are like 5 or 10% slower, someone's going to find that out. And they're going to be caught out. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense from that perspective to do golden sample type stuff, and is why, as we sort of said, we don't really see it happen because there is that risk that it would be uncovered, and they just don't want that attention.
Yeah, I remember last time, and this would be a perfect media outlet to investigate at Gamers Nexus. I remember last time this came up as being a big issue. Steve from Gamers Nexus was like, well, we do extensive overclocking with our Intel CPUs, and pretty much Intel must not like us because every time we get a review sample, it sucks. Like, we just lose the silicon lottery every time. We go buy just a random CPU and it always clocks better than our review unit. At least I had that happen quite a few times. So that in itself kind of proves it. Like Gamers Nexus, certainly one of the bigger media outlets. They get, second or third most views for day one reviews on the platform, and they're not getting cherry-picked gold samples. So that's who I'd be sending them to if I was doing that, and they don't seem to be getting them. Is resizable bar worth it yet? Is there still pitfalls on Nvidia? How come we're never hearing about it? Should it be on as standard now? Love the content, guys. Cheers. Well, a couple of things. It is on as a standard now for the latest, LJ 1700 and AM5 platforms. So, well, a little bit messy. On LJ 1700, all motherboards enable it by default from MSI, ASUS, and ASRock, but Gigabyte disable it. I'm not sure if they've changed that with the latest BIOS, but that was when I checked it last. They should enable it again because Nvidia's addressed some of the issues they had by disabling it at the driver level. So it is technically a standard now. If you buy a new system, good chance resizable bar will be enabled. But yeah, there's certainly pitfalls with resizable bar, which is why we were hesitant, reluctant, you could say, to benchmark with resizable bar. We sort of did it because we were pressured into doing so. But we knew, like we could foresee issues with resizable bar where there was going to be just massive headaches with benchmarking where it breaks performance and then our results are much lower than it would have been without resizable bar enabled. Basically problems of that nature, and that absolutely turned out to be the case. Recently, I was benchmarking, I made a video on this, mind you. I was benchmarking the 1300K, but I was doing memory tuning, and I was collaborating with BuildZoid. We decided to use Gigabyte boards just for simplicity's sake. And I noticed that a couple of games, Spider-Man Remastered, Horizon Zero Dawn, were significantly faster with the 1300K than what I'd published previously. So I'm like, that's not good. Better look into that. And it turned out it was because Gigabyte were disabling resizable bar. Nvidia were meant to sort of whitelist games that, would work well. Anyway, shortly after I published that video, Nvidia updated their drivers and made sure they disabled resizable bar for Horizon Zero Dawn and Spider-Man Remastered. So now performance is where it should be in those games. But as for, I guess your question is it worth it? Depends on the games you play. It may do nothing. It may hurt performance. It may boost performance. It's pretty much been the story since day one with resizable bar. If your system supports it, try enabling it, see what it does for the games you play. But I don't think it's anything too critical you have to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, what is it, like a slight net positive over an average of games?
Last I looked at it was like 3% out of 30 games. You sort of, some games you can get like up to a 20% performance boost. Other games that can hurt performance, they're trying to weed out the games where that happens and solve that. I think moving forward, it's worth having resizable bar on for newer games because they should be designed with it in mind. But it's essentially, it's not something you're paying for. You're not upgrading for resizable bar, so it's certainly not worth it in that sense.
Yep.
But if you've got it, it's probably worth turning on to see what it does for the games you've got. But if you don't, it's not like it's not like I'd be sitting going, mate, what were you doing? Like, you should have had resizable bar on. Not really that situation.
Yep.
All right, Tim, potentially a bit of a controversial one here, so do not get this wrong. This is vital.
Oh. Ooh, all right.
Do you think that the Radeon RX 7600 will be dead on arrival, just like the RTX 4060, since it too will most likely have 8GB of VRAM due to its 128-bit wide memory bus?
Well, I mean, this is depends on the price.
Yes, that's exactly what it depends on.
If it is priced at $200,
winner.
I'd probably say it's not dead on arrival. If it's $300, dead on arrival.
Yeah.
Certainly very questionable.
Very questionable. $400?
$400. What are they doing?
Dunzo.
Have to question AMD's thinking there. But yeah, it really just comes down to the price. I mean, last generation we saw RDNA 2 mid-range cards, mainstream cards launch at prices that were too high, but then over time they fell to much more acceptable prices. I think, what was it, the 6600 launched at like over $300, or was it $300?
So the
RX 6600. What was the MSRP on that? Was it $320?
I wanted to say $330, but
nowadays you can buy them new for $200,
which is great.
So, with AMD sort of doing this thing where they're setting prices really high, so then they get terrible negative reviews.
It's a good strategy.
Over time, it gets the prices lower, and then
psych.
Yeah, and then no one recovers it, so the perception's always bad for whatever reason. If that happens, maybe that would be okay if they launched it at $300. But as we said, even forgetting 8 gigabytes of memory, a card like a 7600 should be a $200 card. So if it had 8 gig of memory, that's kind of even just like restricting it to
cemented
$200.
it as needing to be that.
Because if they make another like 7500 XT that's as bad as the 6500 XT, that card should be like $50. So yeah, I mean, that's pricing these days, isn't it? It's like it all hinges, it hinges on, we don't know what price tier they're going to price these products. It could be completely ridiculous or it could be really fair. And that really makes, all of this argument, doesn't it? But certainly $400 dead on arrival, $300 probably dead on arrival. But yeah, I guess competition as well plays into it, doesn't it? Makes it hard to say it's dead on arrival if the $300 competition is a 4050 with 6 gig of memory.
Especially if on the secondhand market, you can't buy something with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM for that price with similar type of performance.
I mean, right now, you can definitely on the used market buy a 2080 Ti for under $400 used, which has 11 gig of memory. And I think you can get those like $380 on average. So that's $400 is well out of the question.
Yeah, 6700 XTs would have to be pretty low as well, right?
Yes. Well, even a 6700 XT new is like under 400 these days, 380, 350. You have to check my pricing video for the up-to-date information on that. But yeah, I mean, if we're talking $350 for a 6700 XT new, then $300 is like...
So we'll answer that question with a potentially dead on arrival.
Do you think Nvidia would do well to offer both 8 and 16 gigabyte versions of the RTX 4060 like they did with the GTX 1060? So back in the day, that was
what
6
was that?
and
Was
3
that a
gig.
$40 difference or $50 difference?
I think it was
$200 and $250.
Yeah, I believe that was right. Of course, those two cards also had different performance, so it wasn't just a straight 3 versus 6 gig. You did get fewer CUDA cores, I believe, and a cut down memory bus.
You did it was like 8% reduction or something like that.
Maybe not cut down memory bus, but it was typical Nvidia fashion. It wasn't just 8 or 16 gig
No, that's right. It was there was differences there for sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, it'd be good if they did that, especially if, let's just put it out there, I'm just making up numbers. Let's say the 8 gigabyte model was $500.
4060.
Oh, sorry. Let's say $400. Sorry.
Even 400.
Well,
Okay.
It's not going to be below 400.
Yeah, unfortunately,
it's not going to be
right.
below 400, is it? Let's not get people's hopes up. But I'm just putting out random numbers, Tim.
Yeah.
I don't want to see...
I just see people instantly dying in the comments when you say, 4060, let's throw out a price, 500. That sounds all right.
I meant to say 400, and I'm not going to say 300 because although I think it should be 300, ain't no way.
Yeah, especially not for a 16 gig version, but yeah.
But I would love to be proven wrong on that. Nothing would make me happier. But to get on with it, $400 for the 8 gigabyte model, $450 for the 16 gigabyte model, which is... Again, what we saw for a doubling of VRAM, historically, whether it was 4 to 8, 3 to 6, whatever, it was usually only a $50 difference, which...
Especially if it uses GDDR6 instead of 6X, which is more expensive, which I think is probably going to be the case for a 4060 type product.
Then it's definitely feasible because the memory doesn't cost that much. They'd still be making a profit on...
exactly.
Like a larger profit on the 16 gig card.
The Intel Arc products, again, they have an 8 and 16 gig version that's about $50 apart. That uses G6 memory. So it would make sense that they can afford to do that. And even when they offered it for a $50 price difference, based on memory prices, they should still be making more profit from the 16 gig version because the memory price is a bit less than the price difference.
Yep.
So I think, that would work. But the question is whether they would do it, because there's segmentation reasons, right? They want to encourage you to spend that bit more to consider VRAM and things.
Well, yes. So would that work for Nvidia? Probably not. It would work for gamers. I'm not sure it would work.
Great for gamers.
It'd be great for gamers. We would heavily recommend you spend the extra $50 to get the 16GB model, because you'll be able to take advantage of larger texture packs. Games will look much better moving forward. Not just about ray tracing. It's more about higher quality textures, which, again, in a few years, a 16GB texture pack compared to an 8GB texture pack will have a significant difference on the presentation. If there is even an 8GB texture pack that is usable, might be like a Resident Evil 4 type situation. But they're not going to do it because, as Tim's said, they want a 4070 Ti/RTX 4080 upsell type thing. And they also have their professional line of GPUs as well, where that's where they really want to sting you for the extra VRAM, because the professionals can go out and they can buy a 4060 with 16GB of VRAM 3D modeling. That's a cracking good deal. They're not going to spend thousands of dollars on a professional grade GPU for that, because you can use Blender with those GPUs. So a 4060 16GB card would become the ultimate value, bang for your buck Blender 3D modeling for complex models type product. So that's why they're not going to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you could make a point that maybe the professional card should have even more than 16 gig of VRAM, because
the entry level ones, they have up to like 48 at the moment, but you got to pay like nearly $4,000 US
crazy
for that. So
I think this sort of discussion about like 8 versus 16 kind of shows a lack of foresight from Nvidia's part on sort of like, if a 4060 is limited to either 8 or 16 gig options, they probably should have considered changing the memory bus spec to use a different size memory bus. So if it's like 128 versus 192, moving to 192 would have opened the door for a 12 gig version that sits nicely in between those two things and potentially doesn't cannibalize their more entry-level workstation cards that could have, a different configuration offering 16 gig of memory. So by sort of limiting, they've kind of forced themselves into this position where the lower tier cards almost are guaranteed to have 8 gig of memory, because they just won't have the memory bus to support a different configuration.
Yeah, I don't think it's an accident, though. I don't think they've forced themselves into going, oh, whoopsie, now we've screwed ourselves. I think they're like, yes, this was very calculated and has worked perfectly.
Yeah. I think the discussion is changing a little bit in that I think they were hoping that consumers weren't going to be as aware of the issues as they are now.
Definitely. Yeah.
Like in the previous gen, 8 gig was sort of talked about as being on the edge, but there are a lot of outlets and reviewers that didn't really mention the VRAM difference or didn't really consider it because it was considered fine at the time. And I think they were sort of hoping that, maybe we weren't going to see some of the Hogwarts Legacy examples, because, the specs of this card would have been set in stone a long time ago, well before some of these more recent examples have come out. And now that there's this whole VRAM discussion about games needing more VRAM, I think they're in a more precarious position they probably would have liked. They would have liked to sail through with an 8 gig card and hope that people will buy it and then be forced into upgrades or
I think that's true, but I also don't know how aware sort of mainstream gamers are.
Yeah.
And also it seems to be there's just as many people, perhaps they're more fans of Nvidia, but there seems to be a lot of people defending 8 gigabyte cards and sort of attacking our opinion on the subject and saying 8 gigabytes is fine, where
that's the game developer's fault rather than the fault of not having enough VRAM or whatever the argument is.
It's everyone else's fault but Nvidia's. But I agree with what you've said. Yeah.
It's all solved by competition anyway. We can talk about 8 gig being insufficient or whatever, but if AMD comes out with their card at the same price that has 8 gig of memory,
well, it doesn't
it's like,
matter then.
What do you do?
Yeah, you're stuffed.
Whereas, there's obviously that opportunity there for different VRAMs to be quite a key selling point in that sort of price tier. So we'll just have to wait and see what they do. But yeah, I agree with a lot of your points. I don't think they'll make a 16 gig version. If anything, I think I was talking to you about this a few weeks ago. Maybe we'll see in a year's time like a super refresh of these products that increases clocks and CUDA cores a little bit, but then doubles the VRAM across all the models.
Yeah, and I laughed at you.
It'd be a good upsell for them, but
there's no way they'll do it.
No, they won't.
Again, I hope I'm wrong, because it's a win-win this is all a win-win for Nvidia, because they get to give people who buy sort of the lower end cheaper cards less VRAM than they need, in our opinion. And what that means is they're, instead of holding on to their card for 2 or 3 generations, let's say, they find that the very next generation they've got to upgrade again because they're like, well, I paid, let's say, $400 for my 8GB card in 2023, 2024, 2025. I can now get 12. It may even be some sort of minuscule upgrade, but it'll allow me to play the latest games now, so I'll spend another $400 and get that, which is essentially what 3070 Ti owners in particular will be facing. If you've got a 3070 Ti, you're really looking at getting the 12GB of VRAM. I've heard from a lot of 3070 Ti owners that are having problems in like Halo Infinite and stuff like that, where they play for half an hour and on like ultra quality settings or something, and it plays really nice, great frame rates, and then the VRAM buffer starts to fill up and you start getting stuttering and the frame rate just degrades. Quite a few of you have told me that. I haven't seen it firsthand because I haven't played that much Halo Infinite, but yeah, a lot of games are seeing that. So Nvidia, you come back to Nvidia more regularly to spend more money on new products, and then they get to still sell that silicon with twice as much VRAM to the professional grade market for more than, well, twice the price. Because in a recent video we just released, so you could buy an RTX 3070 with 8GB of VRAM for $500 US, or you could spend twice as much for the same silicon with an A4000 and get 16GB of VRAM. So they're selling
big upsell.
Yeah, they're selling you the same. So instead of it being $50 more in the scenario we've just laid out, they're getting $500 more in that one.
Yeah, exactly.
So why would Nvidia change?
Yeah, and I think as well, like,
great business model for them.
I think they've learned a lesson from the Pascal era being too good. A lot of people still have held on to cards like 1070, 1060, 1080 for a long time. I imagine a lot of those people have now upgraded, but that series was released, like 6 years ago, and it had extreme longevity. And it made a lot of people think twice about upgrading to 20 series. And so they wanted to avoid a repeat of that situation, which and again, this is all down to there being a lack of competition. When there's no competition, Nvidia can just do whatever they want. People will be like, yeah, I'll upgrade every generation now. That's just the reality. Whereas if there's a competitor that is offering better longevity, that becomes a key issue for Nvidia and something they have to respond to. Whereas right now, they don't really have to do that as much.
Yeah, they've sort of compete with themselves. So if gamers are aware that, game developers are saying you need this much VRAM, we're not, Nvidia's not giving you that much VRAM, so we're struggling to make games the way we want to make them. There could be a bigger leap forward in game development, but we're being held back. And gamers are like, yeah, why have we had 8GB of VRAM at this price tag now for, that many years? We want more. We're not going to buy your products until you start giving us what we want. And until that starts happening, which is sort of what our series has been about, is getting gamers to demand more from Nvidia and even AMD, then games aren't going to get right. And we sort of got to this point now where the game developers are like, well, the new console generation's well and truly established now. We've got these new game engines. We're just moving forward regardless. It's kind of a funny situation where people are like, well, they can't do that though. They can't leave 8GB, owners behind because we're the majority of the market. And it's kind of like the quad core thing with CPUs. It went on for so long, that stagnation of just quad core at the mainstream, that it started to get to the point where, the quad cores were struggling to play the games because they were starting to use all of the CPU up.
But also it's like the percentage of people with 8 gig GPUs versus the percentage of people with the PS5 is like drastically different.
Yes.
So,
that's true.
They're designing these games for the consoles which sell significantly more games.
Yep.
And there's a much bigger install base there. So that's why they're doing that. It's not like they're sitting there going, hey, we want to screw over all the 8 gig owners. It's more...
No, they've been for years accommodating them.
Yeah.
And now they've got to the point where, as you've sort of said, the thing with VRAM, which it seems like reading of the comments a lot of people don't seem to understand, is they've spent... and game developers have said this. This isn't me, making assumptions or pretending they've said this. Like, game developers have said this. It's been a huge development cost to them to make their games fit within an 8GB VRAM buffer so it works on your RTX 3070 or slower at like high to ultra quality settings or even medium. And they've got to the point now where they're just spilling over that. It's going to like 9GB. It's not like games have all of a sudden, I know we've got The Last of Us Part 1 where it, starts using a lot more VRAM. Though they've managed to cut that down a bit, but it's still like, 10GB at 1080p Ultra or whatever. We're just going to see more of that. And they're not necessarily spilling over miles like what we sort of see in Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing enabled. Though I think with ray tracing enabled in a lot of these games, it's going to push it over. Like A Plague Tale Requiem, great looking game. A lot of people have praised it for how it looks, but you enable ray tracing and blows past 8 gigabytes at,
Yeah.
1080p with the second highest quality preset. So you're just going to see a lot more of that, and that's sort of why we've been ringing the alarm bell on this whole 8 gigabyte VRAM thing. And again, to come full circle on this, if you've got like a lower end GPU and you're used to you're like, well, I paid $200, $300 for this a year ago. I'm used to sort of medium to low type quality settings. Those cards will still be fine. Like, we're not saying 8 gigabyte VRAM cards are dead and can't be used. It's just if you spent $600 US on what you thought was a pretty high end top tier graphics card, it's in a very short period of time, especially if you bought one any time in the last year, you've gone from having what you thought was a pretty high end RTX 3070 Ti to what's like now a pretty low end RTX 3050 type card. And you can't use ray tracing in like a Plague Tale Requiem. You just can't do it. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I think we are starting to see some consumer pushback. There's definitely pushback on pricing at the moment. People, the 3070 flew off shelves, 4070 sitting around on shelves. So there's definitely pushback, at least from that side of things. That's a very obvious sort of issue. People can say, oh, that's way too expensive. It's very, very obvious. The VRAM thing, it's going to take more real world use cases of people running into that problem, and sort of that'll slowly filter through. So I think there's definitely an opportunity that, even without competition, as you say, Nvidia's competing with themselves, that there will be some pushback on that. But again, it would be very easily solved with a really strong opposition card that had that sort of VRAM issue solved. So what was this question about? 8 versus 16 on the one card?
I've forgotten.
Yeah, who knows? We just love talking about VRAM at the moment, don't we?
Let's go to the next question. That'll almost certainly be about VRAM.
Yeah.
Okay, Tim, a question here that we have answered at least once or twice in the past, but it was probably a year since we've talked about it.
Yeah, probably.
Nothing's changed, so we'll just quickly breeze over this one, but I know a lot of you guys are interested. I've seen this asked quite a few times over the last few months. When did you build your first custom gaming PC, and what were the specs? And what was the most difficult part of building at the time, and how has the process changed since then? So for me, it was too long to remember. It was when the Celeron 300A was released, around the year, probably about 23 years ago now. I don't know. Quite a long time ago. I would have been in my late teens at the time. So too long to remember for me, but it was a Celeron 300A on an AOPEN motherboard, I believe, because you could overclock it to at least 450 megahertz, and it rivaled sort of the much more expensive Pentium processors at the time. I'm just going to ignore Tim constantly laughing. Don't remember. It was like SD RAM or something like that. It was before DDR. Probably had a dedicated sound card. I had a 16 megabyte 3DFX Voodoo Banshee graphics card. Couldn't, Yep, so that was cool.
It's a long time ago.
Had like a 15-inch CRT monitor that weighed a ton. I don't know that, and the classic old beige case. Do you remember? Did you ever see the beige?
Yeah.
It was like the big tower thing. It was like bigger than it needed to be.
Yeah, I remember the beige cases.
Didn't have a
floppy
turbo
drive.
Yeah,
floppy drive.
Yeah. I don't think I installed a floppy drive. CD burners were just becoming a thing. They were like $800. But anyway, that was my first computer. Played a bit of Command and Conquer, Quake 3, Rocket Arena. Good times.
Yeah,
dial-up modem.
I remember those days. Mine was, I think it was like 2008-ish. But I did use this, I think I had a Celeron processor or Pentium processor. This was like the Core 2 Duo era.
That was a good era.
The Q6600 was sort of the top end parts that I couldn't afford. So I was just using like the dual core, cheapo ones. And again, back then the overclocking capabilities were still very good.
They overclocked really well.
Overclocked them really well. And I think
like the E8400 or something.
I think I had like a Radeon HD 4000 series GPU. I can't remember the exact one, but it would have been back in those days. So yeah, certainly I don't think a lot has changed in terms of like building PCs. Like,
a lot of change for me.
Yeah, a lot of change for you, but certainly the formats for me, like with the CPU socket, has been pretty much a variation of that. The PCIe slots are a variation. It's all
PCIe.
Well, it would have been PCI.
Probably. Mine was
without the E back
Mine
then.
was ISA, I believe it was.
Yeah.
What
was the? There was another one as well. It was
PC AGP was
AGP,
the advanced graphics port, I think it was. So I had an AGP Voodoo Banshee, but there was also the PCI, not PCI version. So yeah, there was it was like a slot processor
Yeah. Ancient stuff now.
Yep.
Yeah, I had a few like pre-builts before building my own PC that I'd like maybe switch the graphics card out or something like in the AGP era, dating back to, Star Wars
ages.
Battlefront 2, the original one days and before that. So yeah, good times back then. You could actually get good mid-range systems back then for affordable prices. It was crazy.
Don't rub salt in the wound. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah. Following the topic of A620 motherboards, great video by the way, do you think decent sub $100 motherboards won't exist anymore? A series and H series from AMD and Intel are not good enough, and B650/B660 motherboards won't drop below $100 anytime soon.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been testing boards for quite a few years now, and I haven't seen that many decent examples priced below $100 US. Maybe there was the odd B550 board that was around. I don't know. Most of even B550, most of them were up around like 120 for a decent board.
Yeah, it's probably B450.
Yeah, B450.
B350.
But B450 was...
Yeah, some of them were dodgy. Some of them were dodgy.
So I'm not sure there's really... look, I could be wrong here. I could be misremembering, or I just haven't had enough experience with low-end boards, which is fair. But I don't remember too many decent offerings below $100. Like the 100-ish, around the 100 mark, $110, $120. There's been some decent, half-decent boards. And I would say we've got that with the ASRock B650M-HDV/M.2. They're like monitors now.
It's shocking.
They're actually worse than monitors, I think.
Yeah. Don't see too many monitors with a slash
and dash.
Yeah.
So anyway, that is $120 US right now, and that's a cracking good quality motherboard. Really good motherboard, PCIe 5.0 M.2, and it's a good quality board. All CPUs work without a fuss, so that's a good board, $120. So yeah, I think I think AM5 will slowly continue to trend down as time goes by, especially as we get like new CPUs and new chipsets on that platform. The older stuff will get discounted. But yeah, motherboard pricing has certainly gone up. I'm not trying to deny that. But yeah, I also don't know if I've answered your question, because I sort of don't necessarily agree with the question entirely, but maybe that's because I'm, missing some good quality boards that were less than $100. Feel free to correct me in the comments section below if that is the case, and we'll move on to the next question. All right, bit of an interesting question here, Tim. How mad do you need to be to purchase RTX 4080 for the VRAM and not much else? So basically, I guess if put this sort of in a more serious context, you want, maybe you were looking at spending close to $1,000 US on a graphics card, so RTX 4070 Ti, that popped up and you thought, oh, this is what I want, but then you were not super wrapped with getting just 12 gigabytes of VRAM at that price tag. So, and I've seen a lot in the comments, people are like, well, I wanted to buy that was the card I'd planned on buying, but I guess now I'm forced to buy an RTX 4080 for $1,200 US thereabouts, because I want the 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Yeah, I mean, how mad would you be? I know, like, no one put a gun to your head and made you buy it. I guess it could be a bit frustrating and annoying that Nvidia aren't giving you more VRAM, but there are various reasons for that.
It's a lot more expensive. Like, I think that's one of the key considerations. It's not like it's a little bit more, like 4070 Ti is like
US,
400 US is what, it's like 50% more than $800 card. So that's a big premium to pay just for VRAM. And obviously it's a faster card, so that gives you some benefit as well. But I think if you're just deciding on VRAM, you have to weigh it up between, like, 12 gig is almost certainly going to be okay for most games today, and we've seen that. So, is it you save $400 now and you put that towards your next GPU upgrade and you upgrade a bit sooner to something?
I think it'd be the better way to go about it.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better way than sort of buying the more future-proof card today. And we've talked many times in these Q&As about how buying the future-proof product doesn't typically work out to be the better choice than buying the more sensible product now and then just upgrading a bit more often.
Yep.
So I imagine that would apply here as well. But again, it's a difficult discussion because the 4080 is faster. So you are going to be benefiting from the faster product.
Yeah, obviously if there was a Radeon GPU at the same price point that had 20 gigs of VRAM, which there kind of is, then that's also a viable alternative if you're willing to go with a Radeon GPU. There are various reasons why you may not want to do that, so completely understand. But yeah, that would be a strong argument for something like a 7900 XT, because what's that, like 8 gigs more VRAM on that thing?
Yeah.
and they're roughly the same price at the moment. I think it might even be cheaper, the Radeon GPU in some regions.
I think a little cheaper. I think they've started to fall below $800 US. So that gives it a small price advantage. But as you say, people might be swayed by DLSS as an example of something.
There are plenty of reasons for why you would buy a Radeon GPU. There's certain games where the GeForce drivers are typically just better. Fortnite is one of them. Typically, the drivers there are better, especially when they have new season updates and stuff like that. You can get a lot of stuttering with Radeon GPUs. I haven't explored that in a lot of depth for quite a few months now, but probably 6 months. But a while ago, that was a problem. So we're not saying, you would buy the Radeon GPU for the VRAM, but it's a compelling reason, like what we saw with the RTX 3070 and RX 6800. It's almost certainly going to be a better ray tracing product in insert years, like 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It's hard to say at this point, but what we do know is 12 gigabytes of VRAM is quickly becoming sort of right on the edge of what's acceptable for high-end gaming. For mid-range to low-end, I think it's perfectly fine. Ideally, we'd like more, but I think it's perfectly fine. But yeah, like I said, $800 US for 12 gigs. That's rough. Rough.
After your recent testing of DLSS versus FSR, where it's evident that DLSS is the better technology, what are the options that AMD has if they wanted to compete with Nvidia head-to-head? Switch to AI upscaling, even if it kills the primary point of FSR, which was the broad compatibility with cards from both teams? I think this is an interesting question because I think I don't know whether this is a controversial opinion or not, but I think the broad compatibility angle of FSR has kind of failed. I think the point of having broad compatibility with FSR was to encourage game developers to only use FSR, so then they would kill off DLSS, making it less of a selling point. So you're sort of trying to neutralize it by saying, hey, developers, don't bother with DLSS, just use our solution, and then we just neutralize the playing field. There's no advantage for NVIDIA cards or whatever. Whereas I think what we've seen over the last year or two is that FSR is being included in games with DLSS, not as the only solution. And yeah, there's a few outliers, a few AMD-sponsored tiles that only have FSR. There are a few NVIDIA-sponsored tiles that only have DLSS. But the majority of games use both. So for NVIDIA GPU owners, again, we're now 3 generations into cards supporting DLSS. The amount of people who have an NVIDIA non-RTX GPU is really just like entry-level gamers at this point. They're either on Pascal or GTX 16 series. There's a lot of gamers now that can use DLSS on the NVIDIA side that I think the broad compatibility isn't as relevant. Like you sort of, NVIDIA owners have access to DLSS, AMD owners have access to FSR. So it kind of needs to be the best that AMD has to offer versus the best that NVIDIA has to offer, which may mean it's an exclusive AMD feature and they're working on quality by using AI scaling or something. Now, of course, it's possible to make an AI algorithm that works on NVIDIA's tensor cores as well. They definitely could do that if they want to. I guess it's a question of whether they would put in the effort to make it, or just because they would know that most NVIDIA gamers now are using DLSS. They're not choosing to use FSR. So would you put in the effort to make that feature work on NVIDIA anymore? You'd probably just try and make your AMD feature as fast as possible on AMD GPUs. You try and make it the best image quality that you possibly can and go down that path. Obviously, back when FSR 1 launched, this was a much more different discussion. There were still lots of people using like GTX 1060s and stuff and 1070s that couldn't access DLSS. And it kind of made, it was a more compelling feature back then. But just these days, I think that angle hasn't really worked for them. Which, do you think that's a controversial point?
It depends who you ask. No, well, I agree with it. It's what we've been saying. Like DLSS has continued to improve and age well. And we've only continued to see that. We think it's one of the key selling points of a GeForce GPU these days, probably more so than the ray tracing performance, the more mature ray tracing. And I think that it looked like at one point in time that may have been a possible achievement for AMD, but I wouldn't think so anymore. I think that ship sailed. And
like when you got games that have both technologies, who's FSR for now? It's just for AMD gamers, so it has to be the best for them. And maybe there was some alternate reality where FSR just became the only solution for upscaling, which I think that was their plan. But for that to have been the case, I guess it really needed to have been better than DLSS, or at least as good in terms of visual quality, because then all the points about working on all GPUs would make a lot more sense. It'd be like, Why would you bother including DLSS if FSR delivers equivalent image quality? You only have to integrate one technology. It works across all GPUs. It make no sense to integrate DLSS. But the way it ended up was DLSS still offers better visual quality for Nvidia gamers, so it still made sense to include it, which then completely killed off that point. So, yeah, I don't know. I think the next gen, FSR 3, it would make a lot of sense for that to be AMD exclusive. I think they've got enough pull with developers now that they could probably convince them to integrate that anyway. There's certainly a lot of games, including all the technologies, even though AMD's market share is pretty small. So yeah, let's fingers crossed they're doing everything they can to just focus on quality and making it run really well on their products. I think that's where they'll be succeeding moving forward.
Yep. Okay, Tim, I think we're done. That is enough. That's all I can do. I think we've got through most of them.
I'm cooked. That's good. A lot of questions.
Cooked is like an Aussie term for knackered or buggered.
Right,
but
so no one knows what we're talking about.
No, in the US it means like high on drugs or whatever.
Oh, that's right. Well, I guess both those things could apply. You never know.
Okay, see you again next time. We'll just end the video on that note, I think. No, anyway, Tim is, as us Aussies say, buggered.
Which I think, again, has a different meaning in the UK to here. So...
Tim
They're probably thinking something else. Okay,
Tim is tired and it is over answering Q&A questions, and so am I. So we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah,
is that globally safe?
I think I think so. Probably stick away from the slang because you never know what comes out there.
So anyway, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Float Plane Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. Exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&As, funnily enough.
Sounds good.
Alrighty guys, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.